allowed to travel in the bus lane, which by law is 50 metres.
All right, we don't have a lot of time on this, but let's go around the panel on this. It's quite the issue amongst drivers in Auckland, I have to say, around the panel. Julia?
Well, I have to say, for me, I don't really drive in Auckland, so I don't drive in bus lanes.
Shane?
I got a ticket that I have to pay, going to cost me a bit too. Sometimes you can get caught in the bus lane if you're trying to get across and it's not safe. I think they give you sort of like a 60, 65 metres, but it's easy to get busted. But no, we got to respect those bus lanes.
Of course, the perception is, isn't it, Mark, and this is what people say, that the bus lanes are there for revenue gathering, and this sort of money, $20 million a year, will raise that sort of red flag, although the AT group manager does say that there's never been a directive from the council to increase revenue. Your thoughts?
Yes, I think that is the risk when we see that this is a 1,000% increase in 5 years in terms of the level of enforcement. So I think there will be that perception, and the best way to dismiss that is for AT to ensure that they are actually monitoring hotspots. So there is only 26 bus lanes in Auckland, and let's have a look at where these infringements are occurring, and if there are certain bus lanes or certain times when there are more infringements, then that might be indicating that there is a particular problem, and the AA would like Auckland Transport to then actually manage what that situation is. The best example of that is that the AA has received a number of complaints about the bus lane on Kaiba Pass, and that was when there was a change in the hours of enforcement, and that caught people out. It used to be just peak times during the week, and then they moved it to 24/7, and people thought that it wasn't operating on the weekend, and they weren't informed about it. And what the AA would like is, when there's a change like that, for Auckland Transport to put up electronic signs warning people that they've changed the hours of enforcement.
Good idea, Julia?
Yes, I agree. Absolutely, because you know they're there, you know you're not meant to be in there, but you know there's also time frames around them. So if you don't know, I couldn't agree more.
Shane?
I kid you not, folks, that's exactly where I got my ticket.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I kid you not.
What? So, because you didn't know, so you'd agree with these signs then?
Well, again, the other issue, particularly with that lane, is you can get trapped. You know, you might want to turn to go to the left, or you might be coming out of a particular street, and you can get trapped. You can get trapped if the traffic on your right is coming up quickly. You can get trapped in that traffic line, the bus lane. And remember, 60 metres is only about 5 or 6 seconds worth of driving, eh?
It's not long.
No. Hey, Mark, thank you very much for your time there. Mark Stockdale from the AA. But you're doing the right thing, Julia. You're leaving the car mostly at home.
And riding the bike.
Good on you. Nice. Hey, have a great Thursday, everyone. And Julia and Shane, thank you very much for joining me on the panel this afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
We will read, Mike Rehu is in tomorrow, and I'll read out some more of your tipping feedback on Friday. See you later.
Whakarongo mai koe kei te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, Labour announces its tax policy transformational or tinkering around the edges. Grant Robertson joins us live. And the COVID cluster within the cluster, there's 6 new cases linked to the Auckland outbreak. We take the pulse of the two main parties' health policies. Is COVID under control? Who should go to the front of the surgery queue? And how do we keep up with the cost of keeping healthy? Dr. Shane Reti and Chris Hipkins debate the issues. We're on the campaign trail too. What are today's promises? Corrections admits it locked down women in their cells for more than 23 hours a day. And not even coronavirus puts the brakes on the Tour de France for now.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. People at the centre of an Auckland COVID-19 cluster held an illegal meeting last month that was broken up by the police. The meeting by members of the Mount Roskill Evangelical Church breached Level 3 restrictions. 6 new community cases have been reported today, all linked to the fellowship, bringing the total number of confirmed cases in the cluster to 43. The Health Minister revealed this morning some people associated with the cluster in Auckland hadn't fully disclosed their movements and contacts. The Director-General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says the police were alerted to the meeting on August 15th.
I understand that the police were involved in going to ask that meeting to disperse, but I don't believe there was any investigation as such.
A person from the Mount Roskill cluster who was awaiting test results triggered another sub-cluster when they visited a household where people were in mourning. That visit resulted in 22 more infections, including a student at St Dominic's Catholic College. A Manukau ward councillor says many in the Evangelical Church believe the COVID-19 virus has been made up. Councillor Judith Collins says there's an evangelical push at the moment for the church to stand up against the coronavirus, which is not believed to be a real disease. He says the community will also be fearing the vitriol the South Auckland cases received after testing positive. 3 people have been injured by an explosion at an Invercargill home. Emergency services were called to the property in Rothsay Place shortly before 1:30. Timothy Brown has more.
2 people were taken to Southland Hospital with serious injuries following the blast. A third was treated at the scene of the Kāinga Ora-owned home in the Invercargill suburb of Rockdale. A specialist fire investigator for Fire and Emergency is at the scene now. A Fire and Emergency spokesperson says firefighters were called to a fire that started in the kitchen. 2 fire engines attended. Kāinga Ora says they are working with the tenants to ensure they get the support they need, but wouldn't comment on the cause of the blast. Ko Timothy Brown, TNA.
ACT is describing Labour's tax plan as divisive populism and is sending the message you'll be punished if you work hard and succeed. Labour's campaigning on a new top rate of 39% for earnings over $180,000. It's promising no other increases or new taxes. ACT leader David Seymour says the policy is primarily about politics.
And the values beneath it are that it's okay to take people's money if it's a small minority of people. You know, we teach kids work hard and don't pick on people. This is a policy that picks on hard work.
David Seymour also questions whether the change will actually deliver the annual $500 million promised by Labour, saying people earning that much can afford to manage their affairs so as to avoid paying it. A jury has heard that police were listening in live to phone calls made by associates of the Comancheros for almost a year before a major raid on the gang. 5 people, including the New Zealand President Pasilika Naufahu, are on trial at the High Court in Auckland facing drug, money laundering and organised crime charges. Jurors have been played dozens of intercepted phone calls and shown text messages between the defendants and their associates. Detective Sergeant Damien Espinosa says police were granted warrants from the High Court to bug a number of phones.
As a cell phone call is made, we can listen to it as it happens real time. So essentially it's connected through a computer system, connected through to the telecommunications company. And when a call is made, it comes up on our computer that there's an incoming call or an outgoing call being made, and then we listen.
Damien Espinosa. Firefighters in Otago are working to put out 2 blazes. 3 helicopters and 2 ground crews are fighting a burn-off which got out of control at Macrae's, south of Oamaru. It has burnt through 800 hectares of farmland. Another fire on Ben Lomond has covered an estimated 800 to 1,000 hectares and is now contained. It's coming up to 4.5 minutes past 5. The White Ferns cricket captain Sophie Devine believes COVID-19 has boosted their chances of finally wresting the Rose Bowl back from Australia. The side leaves for Australia and 2 weeks of quarantine today to play a 3 T20 series at the end of the month, followed by 3 one-dayers at the start of October when the silverware will go on the line. Australia have held the trophy since 1999 and will again be favourites, but Devine says the pandemic has levelled the playing field.
The great thing about it is we've all sort of been on similar pegging with the lockdown, sort of been slightly different either side of the Tasman, but none of us have played cricket for quite a while, so I think it's a really exciting opportunity for us to go out there and hit the Aussies hard.
Cricket captain Sophie Devine. The top-seeded Milwaukee Bucks have been eliminated from the NBA basketball playoffs by fifth seeds Miami Heat. The Heat have convincingly won the best-of-7 Eastern Conference semi-final series 4-1 after 103-94 win in Game 5. Miami now awaits the winner of the Eastern Conference semi-final series between the Toronto Raptors and the Boston Celtics. The Celtics lead that series 3-2 with Game 6 tomorrow. Two-time Grand Slam champion Naomi Osaka of Japan is through to the US Tennis Open semi-finals after a straight sets win over American Shelby Rogers. Next up for Osaka, who won the title 2 years ago, is in-form American Jennifer Brady. That's the news.
Warnings, people not taking COVID-19 seriously.
There are certainly some within the cluster that perhaps don't accept the science involved here, and that has made this a little more challenging.
Doubts an investigation into fire and emergency will be independent.
If it's going to be a robust investigation, the terms of reference need to be open, fair and objective.
And getting sex ed right.
The Minister is now calling this learning that can't be left to chance.
Your questions answered. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waikato, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. Cloudy periods, brief rain tomorrow night. Waitomo to Wellington, including Taumaranui. Mostly cloudy, gale northerlies about Wellington. A period of rain tomorrow, briefly heavy. For Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, including Taupo and Taihape. Fine weather, gale norwesterlies about Wairarapa. Rain developing tomorrow with snow lowering to 1,000 metres. Nelson and Marlborough, fine today, rain developing tomorrow morning, easing to showers tomorrow afternoon. For Bulla and Westland, cloudy periods with a few showers, turning to rain from the south tonight, clearing tomorrow night. Canterbury, also Otago, except Clutha, rain spreading north today, snow lowering to 700 metres overnight, then easing to showers tomorrow. Gale norwesterlies inland, easing tonight. Fiordland, Southland and Clutha, rain clearing. Showers developing from late tonight. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, rain developing tomorrow night. RNZ National, it's coming up to 7.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Tonight we have Labour and National's health spokespeople in to debate their policies. Where should the massive spend on health go, and what does the COVID recovery look like? But first, there are 6 new cases in the community today, all linked to the Mount Roskill Evangelical Church. There are now 43 cases linked to the church. It's the 7th largest cluster since the pandemic began. It's also been revealed that some members held a meeting during level 3 that police had to disperse. Now there are another 22 cases linked to what the ministry calls bereavement activities. They went to a house or a funeral where the virus spread. Our health correspondent Rowan Quinn filed this report.
As we are still seeing cases emerge within that wider group, we are asking all members of that fellowship to be retested, and also anyone who may have had contact either socially or through work with members of that fellowship.
The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, putting the call out for hundreds of people to get tested or retested. That's because the Mount Roskill subcluster keeps growing. And today the ministry announced a group of 22 cases associated with a funeral 48 people attended and a home visit to the bereaved family. One of those cases is a girl from St Dominic's College in Henderson. She's not a member of the church but was infected by someone who is while at the home of the bereaved family.
The person didn't go to the funeral, but they visited the home of the bereaved person, and they had been tested because they were a known close contact, but didn't have the test result when they visited the home, is my understanding.
Dr Bloomfield also revealed some members from the church had a meeting during level 3.
I understand that the police were involved in going to ask that meeting to disperse, but I don't believe there was any investigation as such.
Health Minister Chris Hipkins says the church cluster was initially difficult to deal with because of some scepticism about the science. But Dr Bloomfield says Māori and Pacifica public health teams and nurses within the church helped to change that.
Once there were good networks into or links into the community, there's actually been a high level of testing and support from that church community for the testing and follow-up.
St Dominic's is closed for 3 days for a deep clean, and close contacts of the student are being identified. Other schools in the area are taking precautions. Henderson North School's principal, Irene Ogden, has asked siblings of any St Dominic's students to stay home too.
I think we're probably all very anxious because we have gone through one lockdown, 2 lockdowns, and now we live in unusual circumstances. So we are anxious, but we are following the procedures to keep ourselves as safe as we can.
On Rathgar Road near St Dominic's, some people hadn't even heard about the confirmed case, but others were worried.
Just got me worried when I heard about it on the news because my kids just go to a primary just up the road.
It's a bit scary nearby from our neighbourhood. Now we need to be a little bit careful and see people are using the Q codes and everything when they come into the store and make their distance and follow the rules.
Hopefully it hasn't affected or infected many other people around in the area, and while they are connected to existing clusters, I don't think we need to go into any panic modes at all.
It was also revealed today a bus driver on the Northern Express who was working on Thursday and Friday has COVID. Dr Bloomfield says passengers on his buses are considered casual contacts, so need to keep an eye on their health, but are only at low risk of contracting the disease. Mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Rowan Quinn tēnei.
The calls for a total ban on live exports of cattle are growing following the capsize and sinking of a vessel in the East China Sea. The Ministry for Primary Industries temporarily halted applications for live shipments last week after the ship, Gulf Livestock 1, went down in a typhoon. There were 43 crew, including 2 New Zealanders, and nearly 6,000 cattle on board. Andrew McRae reports.
The Japan Coast Guard is continuing to search for any more survivors, including New Zealander Scott Harris, a herd manager, and Lockie Bellaby, but has scaled it back. 3 crew have been found, 2 survived and the body of another was recovered. Back here, 28,000 cattle awaiting export are currently on 4 quarantine farms, facing slaughter if the temporary ban continues for too long. The Ministry for Primary Industries says they're being well looked after and no decision on their future has yet been made. John Hellstrom is the former chair of the National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee. He believes the temporary ban will be lifted to allow for the cattle to be exported, but after that he wants the practice stopped.
We've got other technology to get that genetic material over there. It's a very small economic benefit for New Zealand in spite of a few people making money out of it.
He says his main concern is not about how the animals are treated on the transport ships.
I think in general the welfare management is very good right through to the point of arrival. My concern is what happens after they get there, and I've seen a lot of our cattle in different countries around the world, and I'd have to say none of them have been in conditions as good as they would have been back in New Zealand, and some of them have been in very poor conditions.
The Veterinary Association is calling for greater transparency and better monitoring of cattle on the ships before any consideration is given to lifting the temporary ban. Its Chief Veterinary Officer, Helen Beattie, says it's essential to have an independent animal welfare scientist on board.
To do what's called a 5 domains animal welfare assessment, and that would then give us a whole bunch of really objective measures to understand what that experience of the actual trip itself looks like and feels like for those animals. So it's very hard to make a definitive comment when we don't have that really critical piece of information.
She says unless a welfare assessment is made, it will be hard to support resuming exports. Waikato vet and farmer Alison Dews supports the call for improved monitoring of any shipments, but does question the claims the animals are going to be worse off in China.
Every case is going to be different, isn't it? And I just don't think we can use averages or average assumptions that every live export shipment they're going to go to a worse situation. I just don't think we have that detail.
While she expects the ban to be lifted, she has concerns about the trade.
brings into question how we treat our production animals versus our companion animals. Would we send our, for example, put horses, cats or dogs that are our close companion pets in the same situation? There's still this differentiation between production animals and how we treat them and our companion animals, and yet they're all sentient beings.
The next cattle ship is due in New Zealand within 10 days. MPI says what happens next is still being discussed between the exporter and the shipping company. For Checkpoint, ko Andrew McRae-Tene.
It is 5:15 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen for your feedback on anything you hear on the program this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Remember, we've got the two health spokespeople for National and Labour on after 6. Flick us your questions while you've still got the chance. Labour's vowing to create a new top tax tier for people earning more than $180,000 a year if it's re-elected next month. The party unveiled its tax policy in Wellington today, saying its plans strike the right balance for the COVID recovery. The increased tax rate would affect 2% of New Zealanders and raise $550 million a year. But Labour's allies and its opponents are already criticising the plan. The Greens say it doesn't go far enough, while National thinks there are more taxes to come. Our political reporter Charlie Drever was at today's announcement and filed this report.
Labour's finance spokesperson Grant Robertson says the new top tax rate of 39% will cover those earning more than $180,000. He says it will only affect the top 2% of earners.
This policy is about everyone pitching in to do their bit to help our country rebuild, to protect the vital public services we all need, and to keep our debt under control as we continue our fight against this virus and drive our recovery.
Labour's also promising to close loopholes so multinationals pay their fair share of tax, and says it would be prepared to implement a digital services tax if an international solution can't be found. But beyond that, Grant Robertson says Labour will not implement any new taxes or raise income tax over the next 3 years. The party's revenue spokesperson, Stuart Nash, says the policy hits the right balance.
This tax policy is not only fair, but is extremely fiscally responsible and prudent given the extraordinary times we now find ourselves in.
But the ACT leader David Seymour says compared to the government's current borrowing, the tax revenue will be fiscally insignificant. He says the biggest beneficiaries will be tax planners and accountants.
Many of the people eligible to pay it will be people who are in a position to manage their affairs to avoid paying it. So no doubt there will be less tax than Labour thinks.
By comparison, National's tax policy will deliver some form of tax relief by increasing the amount people can earn each year based on the rate of inflation before higher rates kick in. It's promising no new taxes, a repeal of the Auckland fuel tax and depreciation write-offs for new business assets. National's finance spokesperson Paul Goldsmith says more tax is not the way to bring a country out of recession. He says the new rate is just the start.
There's every indication that a government that can't control its spending and manage its finances will eventually come after more and more New Zealanders.
But Labour leader Jacinda Ardern has hit back at that comment.
This is our policy. We have now released it. Anything that comes from the opposition should be characterised as simply opposition politics, and sadly it seems misinformation.
While some parties are recoiling at the thought of introducing a top tax rate, the Green Party doesn't think it goes far enough. Co-leader James Shaw says the party does not address the growing wealth gap in Aotearoa.
As a result of COVID-19, people who own property and assets are actually getting wealthier, whilst people who work for a living are not. And in fact, you are seeing that for the first time in recorded history, median incomes have declined recently.
His party is campaigning on plans for 2 new top income tax bands and a 1% wealth tax on net worth of more than $1 million. James Shaw says the Greens will need to be at the negotiating table after the election to make sure inequality in New Zealand is addressed. But Grant Robertson isn't leaving any wiggle room.
This is the policy that Labour is campaigning on, and we will only implement the changes that are in this policy.
Labour plans to legislate for the changes to take effect from next April. For Checkpoint from Wellington, ko Charlie Drever, DNA.
Well, Labour's finance spokesperson Grant Robertson joins me now. Good evening. Is this transformational tax policy?
This is tax policy that's appropriate for this time of COVID-19. It's a time of massive uncertainty for everybody. And so what we've done is put forward a policy that we think is balanced right between giving certainty to people, but also asking 2% of New Zealanders to pitch in a bit more. For 98% of New Zealanders, nothing will change. And I think at this period in our history and at this moment in time, that is the right approach.
But would you concede in saying that it's not transformational tax policy? It's right for right now.
That's correct. I mean, I'm not trying to sell it up as anything other than the right policy for this time. Clearly, COVID-19 has come along and disrupted our world. We have a suite of policies that are about, future-proofing our economy, building New Zealand back better as part of our economic plan. This revenue policy supports that, but obviously we are aiming for sustainable growth through that economic development policy, which is about things like skills and small business and investing in infrastructure.
Well, can you talk me through your thinking here? Why not go for a lower dollar figure that triggers the tax bracket, or a higher percentage of tax take?
Again, it's a balanced question. I mean, obviously this affects 2% of taxpayers. We wanted to make sure that the vast bulk of New Zealanders, 98% in the case of this policy, knew that things were going to stay stable, that there was continuity, that they could understand the contribution that they would be making to keeping our vital public services going and to keeping a lid on debt. And we felt that those in the top 2% could pitch in and a little more to help us do that. So really it was just a question of balance and making sure that we were able to support the services we need.
Previously, you had a policy 36% rate on 150k. Would that have given you more in comparison, and why not default to that position?
That was a previous Labor Party policy in times gone by. It wasn't one that we looked at this time round. We felt that 39 cents was a reasonable amount for people earning $180,000 or more than $180,000 to pay.
It doesn't give you that much, though, does it, in revenue? Because you're talking about $500 million here. In terms of COVID-specific borrowing, what will be the total by the end of the year that you've borrowed?
Yeah, look, obviously I understand that relative to what we're spending on COVID, we've got the $50 billion fund there. That is important in terms of that massive response that we gave, things like the wage subsidy scheme, and we've still kept $14 billion back. This is permanent. This is a permanent change to the tax system. It'll be $2 billion over the 4-year period that we do budgets, and that will support the provision of services like health and education and help keep debt under control.
So is COVID basically just giving you the social licence to do what you wanted to do anyway, but it might have been just a bit more unpalatable to people if there wasn't COVID?
Well, look, the way that the Labor Party puts its policies together is that from the whole period we've had COVID is the period in which we've been putting this together. And so that's clearly been part of the picture, that we are in the face of a 1 in 100 year shock where we're still not sure, anyone in the world is not sure of what the outcome will be. So, no, this is something that we believe is the right thing to do. It's a position that, builds on our progressive tax system, sees 2% of New Zealanders pay a little more and 98% stay the same, and that's, to me, the balance that we need in such uncertain times.
But if you describe it as right for right now, if you weren't compromising because of COVID, if you weren't trying to seek that balance that COVID has enforced on you, what would your tax policy be? What would you have gone for?
Oh, look, I don't think, unfortunately, that at least there is a very, very much a hypothetical situation.
So is this vastly different from what you would otherwise propose?
Not particularly, but I don't think it's possible to disentangle ourselves from the situation we find ourselves in. As a political party, it's our job to be able to give New Zealanders that sense of certainty, that sense of confidence going forward from here. We've invested a huge sum of money in making sure that we've got New Zealanders through this with things like the wage subsidy.
Okay.
We've still got $14 billion there. This is a change that I'm happy to stand beside, but we can't have a hypothetical situation. We're in COVID. We've got to deal with it.
You've made some guarantees around this. You say that there's going to be no other taxes and no other increases in income tax, right? Surely that's dependent on your coalition partners in any negotiations, or are you saying this is an absolute bottom line, no matter who you might be in government with? If indeed you are.
This is Labor's tax policy, and what we're saying is this is what we will be implementing in this term of government if we get the opportunity to be elected.
When you say it's Labor's tax policy, I just want to be clear, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is really important because that's been said about other policies that you've had as well. That was Labor's policy, but hey, we're working in an MMP environment and these are what our partners want. So, are you saying this is absolutely a bottom line for tax, or if, for example, you go in with the Greens and they want more and they dig their toes in, is this negotiable?
This is the tax policy that we will be implementing as a Labor government.
Whether you're in coalition or not?
As I say, we're campaigning for ourselves. This is what an election is about. Other parties are fully entitled to campaign for
I understand that. I really do understand that. But what I'm saying is it's one thing to promise people that this is Labor's policy, and it's another to say that regardless of what any partners in government want, you are going to stick with this. So I'll just ask it again to be absolutely sure. Is this your bottom line in terms of income tax policy if you need to form a coalition or a confidence and supply agreement?
A Labor government will be implementing the policy that we announced today, Lisa. It's not a matter of bottom lines for us from this perspective, and I haven't actually heard the Green Party use that phrasing either. From our perspective, this is what we will implement, just what we announced today.
Won't wealthy people just be able to avoid this via financial setups, trusts and using advisors?
Well, no, because we've resourced the Inland Revenue Department to make sure that can't happen. And if people are avoiding or evading their taxes, we will crack down on them. And I'm confident with the new systems we've got at IRD, we will do that. I think the vast majority of New Zealanders are law-abiding and they pay their taxes as they're meant to. For those that don't, we will crack down on them.
Do you regret ruling out a capital gains tax? Because arguably you've backed yourself into a corner with what options are available to you right now.
Well, that was a decision that was taken, and I backed that decision by the Prime Minister. We've been very clear about that. We're sticking to our word on that. There are many things that we can do to improve people's access to housing, particularly on the supply side, where we make sure we do build more houses, but also on programs like progressive home ownership, where we can support people into them. So, again, coming back to the beginning of the interview, Lisa, this is the right policy for this time to provide certainty and stability.
We're pushed for time, but can I get a quick answer on this? So multinationals paying their fair share of tax, you're waiting on an OECD recommendations here. Can you guarantee the introduction of a targeted tax regime for those companies in the next term, should you be in government?
That is our intention if the multilateral negotiations fail. It will be far better for New Zealand if we can actually get an agreement that sticks across the world. But if it doesn't, we will introduce a tax, and that's what we announced today.
Appreciate your time this evening. That's Labor's finance spokesperson, Grant Robertson. Australia is demanding answers as to why 2 journalists were visited by Chinese authorities in the middle of the night before swiftly departing the country. Bill Birtles and Mike Smith, Australia's last 2 accredited journalists in China, arrived home this week following a tense diplomatic standoff. Last week it was revealed an Australian journalist, Cheng Li, had been detained. Chinese authorities say that relates to criminal activity endangering national security. The ABC's Philip Williams has this report.
When the ABC's Bill Birtles and the Fin Review's Mike Smith touched down in Sydney, it was the end of a dramatic few days as Australia's last correspondents in China were flown home. But theirs is a well-worn path. The Chinese government has forced a number of foreign journalists and photographers out of the country from high-profile publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. The Chinese government appears to have made a decision it can live without the scrutiny from foreigners. Steve Butler is with the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Well, it really seems, as far as journalists go, that the gloves have come off in China. I mean, there's always been a hostile attitude toward the foreign press, but for whatever reason, they now seem to be extremely uninhibited in the way they're going after the press. It's not just Australia, but it's the United States. And you have to say that this tactic of denying exit over a national security investigation, it really marks a new low. I mean, you could see it continue to a point where there are no foreign correspondents in China.
What does it say about the safety of those that are still there and still operating in China?
I think it's a bit tenuous, really. I think what you've seen in China is that they're willing to use a kind of hostage diplomacy. Now, I think many people have speculated that the arrest of the China State News correspondent, who's Australian at Chunglei, was a kind of a diplomatic hostage situation, and I think this could be seen in that same sort of vein.
Is there any correlation, do you think, between the spate of expulsions and the Trump administration's crackdown on Chinese journalists operating in the US?
Absolutely there's a connection. I mean, we have been critical of the U.S. policy over this. So this administration, under the banner of reciprocity, and the idea that we're going to treat you the same way that you guys treat us, but it hasn't worked out. What's really happened is the U.S. has imposed these restrictions, and the Chinese are only too happy to comply and go the extra step. They don't like these foreign correspondents anyway, and what the U.S. is doing really just gives them an excuse to crack down further.
The bad blood between the US and China is getting worse, with President Trump repeatedly using the word decoupling to describe a future where the United States doesn't rely on China for much at all.
China's spending the money we give them to build up their military. So when you mention the word decouple, it's an interesting word. So we lose billions of dollars, and if we didn't do business with them, we wouldn't lose billions of dollars. It's called decoupling, so you'll start thinking about it.
And that was Donald Trump ending that piece from the ABC's Philip Williams. And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, we debate health with National's Dr Shane Retty and Labour's Chris Hipkins. If you're watching us, Shane Retty will join me here in our Auckland studio and Chris Hipkins will be on our gallery camera. We would love your feedback. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Facebook is at Checkpoint or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Let's go to the headlines now with Susanna.
The police broke up a meeting of people at the centre of an Auckland COVID-19 cluster last month for breaching level 3 restrictions. 6 new community cases have been reported today, all linked to the Mount Roskill Evangelical Church, bringing the total number of confirmed infections in the cluster to 43. A Manukau ward councillor says many in the fellowship believe the COVID-19 virus has been made up. 2 people have been taken to hospital with serious injuries following an explosion at an Invercargill home. A third was treated at the scene of the Kāinga Order-owned home in Rockdale. A specialist fire investigator is on the scene. Labour's finance spokesperson says its proposed tax policy is appropriate in a time of massive financial uncertainty. If elected, the party plans to introduce a new top tax rate of 39% for people earning more than $180,000. Grant Robertson told Checkpoint the balance is right by asking 2% of New Zealanders to pitch in a bit more to support essential services. He says it will generate $2 billion over 4 years. ACT leader David Seymour says Labour's tax policy is primarily about politics. He says it sends the message you'll be punished if you work hard and succeed. The Veterinary Association is calling for an independent animal welfare scientist to be on board if the temporary ban on livestock exports is lifted. The ban was brought in last week after the sinking of the carrier Gulf Livestock 1 in the East China Sea, which was carrying 6,000 cows. The association says it would be hard to support exports being resumed unless a welfare assessment is made. The police have described to a jury how they listened in to phone calls made by the associates of the Comancheros for almost a year before a major raid on the gang. Jurors at the High Court in Auckland have been played dozens of intercepted phone calls during the trial of 5 people linked to the gang who are facing drug, money laundering and organised crime charges. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just tuning in, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. We're going to get to our health debate shortly, but first the business news with Nicholas Poynton, who's in the Auckland newsroom tonight. Nicholas, so you've got a bunch of economic numbers out today and they're painting, well, quite a rosy picture of the economy. Can you give us a bit of a wrap-up of the headline numbers?
Well, yeah, to borrow a term, I'd say we've had a cluster of new economic surveys, numbers and forecasts out today. And starting with ANZ's preliminary survey of business confidence, it's quite a surprising result. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the latest restrictions we saw last month would see business confidence take a bit of a step back. Well, actually, it turns out the opposite has happened in the first week of September. Business confidence, it's up 16 points, and and firms' view of their own future is also up as well. The results certainly surprised ANZ's chief economist Sharon Zollner, who says she did not pick this at all. When I asked her about what's really driving this optimism, she thinks it's because a lot of businesses are taking a much more longer-term view right now with COVID-19. And she says that also the government's fiscal stimulus, that's the wage subsidy, that's really bolstering businesses at the moment. And they believe that the latest restrictions, the effects of it won't persist for much longer. It also says that ANZ has also put out its truckometer. It shows freight movement. So they say this is a really accurate snapshot of what's going on in the economy at the moment. They say that freight movement was down by about 3.5% for the month of August. But the bank's economists, they're saying that they're not sure how accurate this data actually is. That's because, well, when we had those restrictions last month, travel in and out of Auckland was severely hampered with these roadblocks, and that may have added a little bit more noise in the traffic data we saw for the month. Also, we had some numbers out from Stats NZ, that is the wholesale activity in manufacturing sales for the second quarter, and these are the last significant numbers we're going to get out from Stats NZ ahead of the big second quarter GDP numbers next week. And what they show is that for both those categories, the numbers are way down. But look, in line with a lot of what we've been seeing lately, they aren't as bad as first expected. And to top it all off, ASB, they've revised their GDP forecast for next week. Back in May, they said second quarter GDP was going to fall by about 20%. On Monday, they said it was going to fall by about 13%, and they've reduced it once again. They now expect it to reduce by 11%. So if we take a step back from all of these numbers, we throw them all together, what it really shows us is that the economy is in a far better place than many people were expecting way back in March. So there's still a long way to go, but when the recovery gets underway, we will be starting from a much higher base. And just before I leave, I'll do a quick wrap of the markets. There's a sea of red on the NZX today as they followed the big tumble of tech stocks over in the US. Our top 50 index was down by about 1.3%, or 157 points to 11,739. Our dollar is at 66.2 US cents, 91.6 Australian and 51 British pence. And gold, we can't forget, it's down to $1,929 US an ounce.
Thanks, Nicholas. That's Nicholas Poynton with our business wrap. As a country, we spend billions on health each year, and it is one of the leading concerns for voters. Right now, the world is in the grip of a pandemic, but that doesn't mean other health needs, elective surgery, funding deficits, specialist staff shortages, and growing mental health issues fade away. So how do we balance immediate needs in a health crisis against increasing longer-term demands on the health dollar? Tonight, National and Labour's health spokespeople are joining us. If you are watching us, Dr. Shane Retty's with me in the Auckland studio, and Chris Hipkins joins us on our gallery camera from Wellington to debate the issues and hopefully shed some light on their policies. Chris, can I start with you today in the news of the day? We've now got a cluster within a cluster within a cluster. A group of people have breached Auckland's level 3 lockdown. You've asked the police to step in. What exactly do you want them to do?
Well, the police are going to be helping the Auckland Regional Public Health Service with their contact tracing process, making sure that the right people are being identified, making sure that the right people are being tested, so that we can get on top of this new small group as quickly as we possibly can.
Is it time to start prosecuting people? A lot of text into the program this evening are angry people about what's happened here.
Well, one of the things that the investigation will show eventually is whether or not this was a deliberate act, whether or not people deliberately didn't disclose who they'd been in contact with, or whether it was simply an omission. It does seem to be a relatively limited number of contacts that weren't disclosed that have then gone on to infect a number of other people. So that's what the investigation process gets to the bottom of.
There were 48 people at a funeral. Was it a mistake to allow an exception for funerals to have up to 50 people when previously it had been 10? Did you make a mistake?
No, I don't think so. It looks like the people who operated the funeral did all of the things right. So they did the distancing required, they did the contact registers for people at the funeral. It would appear actually that most of the positive cases here may have been associated with other events around the funeral, so people visiting each other at home, for example. So those are all of the things that the investigation looks at the moment.
Okay, let's bring Shane Retty into the conversation. Shane, do you think 50 people at a funeral is a bad idea? Would you have stuck with the 10?
Hello, Lisa. Thank you for having me. Look, I think in this situation, I'm interested in the prosecution sort of being brought forward into this. I think if you want a good outcome in this situation, it's not clear to me that prosecuting people is the way to get a good outcome. If you want people to reveal where they've been, if you want to do effective contact tracing, I would have thought doing contact tracing in a culturally competent sort of way, get people on board, have them explain where they've been, how they've been, and that sort of thing, that may be more effective than actually bringing forward prosecution. There may be a place for that, but I'm not sure we should jump into that right now.
Aren't we already doing that?
It would seem that we are, and so I'm interested to know if we've explored all those other opportunities first. Again, give back people, give them the chance to come forward with the best information to help us with contact tracing.
And the start of this recent cluster, do you think it would have been possible to have what's been described as a postcode lockdown, a more, centralised lockdown, say, of a particular suburb rather than a whole lockdown of Auckland? Could you have managed that?
I think there could have been a place for that, and people, when I say that there might be a place for postcode lockdown, and I've raised the question of whether the Pocono border, for example, could have been moved further north, maybe to the other side of Waiuku, say where New Zealand Steel is, they raised the question of, well, what about Melbourne? The postcode lottery didn't work for Melbourne. My response to that would be, well, Melbourne was actually 2 weeks late doing their lockdown, and they didn't carve out the older people like we have. So my first response is I think there is a place for postcode lockdown. Secondly, if we consider when we have fruit fly, we lock down a suburb. This is not new to Aucklanders. Now, it's a different sort of lockdown. It's not as constrained as we're doing here now, but we say if you cross this street and go into that suburb, there's a certain set of conditions. So it's not foreign to us.
Chris, do you see a testing regime that would allow travel in and out of New Zealand with no or shorter quarantine before we get a vaccine?
Well, hang on a minute. If we come back to the postcode lottery that Shane has just proposed here, that would put us in the same position as Melbourne, where they ended up with an ongoing level 4 style lockdown. If you look at where the most recent cluster has spread across Auckland, it is right across Auckland, including the North Shore, the South, the East and the West. And if we had just drawn a line on a map and said we're going to take a pick and say we think it's isolated to this area, we'd almost certainly be dealing with a much, much larger outbreak than we are at the moment. I think the National Party's approach here is a dangerous one.
Is it dangerous, Shane?
No, it was a geographical boundary. It was a council boundary. They said, well, let's just sort of call this, and it was a wide swath across all of Auckland. So I'd come back. Melbourne failed because they didn't go into lockdown early enough, and they didn't secure those older people, which thankfully we have.
So given your position on the ability to do smaller lockdowns, do you see a possibility of travel in and out of New Zealand? Could we develop a testing regime whereby you don't have to spend 14 days in quarantine, you could make that shorter, and to open up the borders somewhat before we get a vaccine? Is it possible?
So on the issue of a vaccine, I call it a horizon of hope because it's a long way away. It's probably going to be maybe 12, 18 months, if not longer. So I'm reluctant to consider that an effective tool just here and now in our toolbox. To answer your question, we've always said the borders need to be safe before anyone can come across the borders. In fact, you'd heard us say last week that one of the things in our Border Protection Agency proposal is that we have exit testing or departure testing from your point of departure before you come into New Zealand.
Yes, but you've still got 14 days at the other end. So in the UK, they're trialling testing at the airport. Where you arrive, you're tested, and then you're tested at the 5-day mark, and looking to see what the results of that for a potentially shorter stay in quarantine. Would you go there?
No, I wouldn't, because I've seen the Sean Hendy modelling, and what that suggests is that 14 days with a day 3 and day 12 test is probably the sweet spot.
Chris, experts around the world say this pandemic will not be the last. So do we need purpose-built isolation facilities?
Look, I think we do need to accept that, yes, there are likely to be future pandemics, and we need to start thinking about planning for those. Of course, different pandemics would have different characteristics. So you've got to be, we're not necessarily sure what we're dealing with until we're dealing with them. So you've got to plan for a variety of different scenarios.
But pandemics, by their very nature, are infectious diseases. So do we need to build purpose-built isolation facilities, yes or no?
Look, I wouldn't go that far at this point.
Shane?
Yeah, I wouldn't actually disagree with that either. They come infrequently. I think we need to have the people response ready to move quickly, but whether we should have the bricks and mortar in place in perpetuity for the years between incursions, not so convinced on that.
When there is a vaccine, Chris, who will be the priority for vaccinations? Will you go first with medical staff?
Look, we're going through that process at the moment, and it would depend how many vaccines we were able to get, but obviously we'd be looking at those more susceptible to COVID-19, so looking at who's at greater risk if they do get it. We'd obviously be looking at our border workers, and we'd be looking at those who work in the health system, so it might not be the same prioritisation we would do for other vaccinations, because obviously there are some people who are at greater risk than others here, so the people at the border, for example, will be at greater risk potentially than for other viruses.
So would you put border staff ahead of medical staff in the queue for a vaccine?
Not necessarily. I mean, we're going through that process at the moment. And it's going to depend how many vaccines we could get in the first wave. Our goal here is going to be to vaccinate as many people as quickly as we possibly can. And obviously we want to secure as many vaccines as we possibly can and administer them as quickly as we possibly can. But at this point, we don't know whether will we be able to get 4 or 5 million all at once, or will we have to get them in waves. And if we do get them in waves, we've got to have a priority list ready. So we're going through that process now. But I can tell you that the people who are most likely to be affected by COVID-19 need to be right at the top of the list.
Shane, who would be your priorities for vaccinations?
So this would be a risk stratified approach, and it would be those who is having the most contact with those who are likely to be carrying. What is the nature of that contact? How long is that contact? So that would put border staff ahead
of medical staff in terms of contact?
Not necessarily. If medical staff were doing, for example, aerosolising type procedures, then they'd be at higher risk. But it's not that difficult. Who's coming in contact? How long are they in contact? What is the nature of that contact? So that's a good sort of framework to make decisions on. What I haven't heard here is our older people. They can't be too far away from a vaccine process because we know they're extremely vulnerable. But yes, it would be those who are having contact with potentially infectious people.
Okay. COVID raises mental health issues, and we know from past disasters there is a clear trajectory of increased distress and in some cases suicides. What would your plan be to navigate us through an ongoing pandemic and to avoid that kind of fallout?
So if we look at the stages of mental health during a pandemic, it's not that far away from the Kubler-Ross sort of stages of grief, where you start with a heroic response and then you go to sort of a honeymoon period, which is probably our level 4 and level 3. And I think we're probably in that disillusionment period here before we get to recovery. And we'd like to get through the disillusionment period as quickly as we can. What we'd be doing is we'd be bringing frontline services much closer to the community. So what we're wanting to do here is develop what Portman and Kluckman call that social cohesion. That's what's going to be important for our recovery. And to do that, we're going to need to take mental health services closer to the community, designed by the community. It may be specialists, actually, for example, in GP rooms, general practice rooms. We're going to need to utilise tools like e-learning. We're going to have to bring in that large cultural capital component to design these sort of mental health programs. That's what we're going to need to get the social cohesion, which is the answer to our recovery.
Chris, what have you got planned for this?
Well, what Shane's described is exactly what the government's doing. So we are putting more frontline mental health services into primary practice. We are working closely with communities to make sure that investment is going to the right places. It's delivering mental health support in ways that meets the needs of different communities, because it's not a one-size-fits-all model here. Different communities need different things.
But we know already that mental health services are swamped, don't we? And that demand exceeds capacity. So what more will you do?
Well, you've got to build up the capability. So a big part of the $1.9 billion investment that the government made in mental health in the budget 2019 is designed to build up the capability and the capacity to train more people, to get them into those frontline roles where they can provide that extra support. But we also need to start earlier as well. Mental health support for our young people is an area where we can do a much better job. So you're seeing, as a result of COVID-19, the government putting extra investment into our schools and into our sort of those primary intermediate years where young people can start to develop mental health problems, and making sure that they're getting access to the sort of support they need so that it doesn't become a compounding issue that they then lose control of. We want to provide those young people with the extra support they need, and we will see the benefits of that over a long period of time.
But Lisa, this is a valid argument. There was a big number put into budget, 2019, $1.9 billion. But the argument's also made that only $125 million of that has been spent. So we've sort of got to talk about what the number is and what's actually being deployed. Furthermore, it's been put to me that maybe only 4% of general practices are getting any frontline services as a consequence of that budget. So it's fine to apportion the funding, but is it actually being deployed?
Well, I think Shane sort of contradicted himself here, because he said that he thinks we need to go out and you need to co-design and you need to work with communities to identify the best way of delivering mental health services in those communities. And then he's also saying, but we want it all done right now. Actually, those two things are contradictory. If you want to bring people along for the ride, if you want to have them involved and empowered through this, then you do have to take a little bit more time. And I also just want to point out that you can't just magic up the workforce out of nowhere to train people to do these things. It takes time.
In respect of that, and we've got heaps to get through, so I'm going to ask you to try and crack through some of these next three questions. We know from the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists that they're short about 25% of specialists nationwide, they say. So that means longer waiting lists, longer wait times for patients. Where are you going to get that workforce from, Chris?
We need to train more. There's no question we need to train more.
But that takes time, as you've said.
Absolutely, but we're working on increasing the medical workforce in New Zealand. It takes time. It takes a long time to train a doctor, and so we've got a lot of work to do in that area. There's no question about that.
Okay, there's 1,700 New Zealand trained doctors who are working in Australia. Shane, what would you do to get them back?
Thankfully, they're coming back, as I understand it, anyway, because we're a safer place here at the moment. But what we'd want to do is we want to make a health system that's attractive to them and give them some interest in bringing their skills back into New Zealand. So we'd want to do that first. But can I also
pay them a bonus to come home?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I think if they want to contribute to a system, to a great place to live and a great place to work, that's enough of an incentive for people to come home. I mean, look at the numbers we're seeing coming home right now because of coronavirus. But what I will add is that we've already said that we'll put out to tender a rural medical school, a third rural medical school. So there's our intent to developing the workforce. And while we're talking about doctors, let's remember we've also got an ageing nursing cadre that we also need to train up, and they train in half the time.
Chris, I want to ask you about the cannabis referendum. Are you going to vote to legalise cannabis?
In both of the referendum questions, I've indicated that I'm not going to publicly disclose how I'm going to vote.
Why not?
It's a
You're the
personal
health
vote.
minister. You're the health minister, and it materially impacts on what we might do with our health system, the funding, etc. That's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it, on this question?
No, and I will implement whatever New Zealanders vote for. Ultimately, this is New Zealanders' decision, and I'm not going to be campaigning for or against either of those questions.
I'm not asking you to campaign for either. Just wanting to know.
Well, simply disclosing the way I'm going to vote and the reasons why I'm going to vote. I get a disproportionate amount of airtime, and so I would be campaigning if I was to get into that, and I'm not going to.
Are you concerned, that people may think differently about you if you say either way what you're up to?
No, I've indicated that I'll honour the referendum result. I'll form my own personal view. I'll vote individually, as every New Zealander will do. It's my personal view, but I will ultimately. And I will ultimately implement whatever decision gets made as a member of the government, should I be in that fortunate position.
Shane, we know that you're voting against it because Judith Collins told us that the entire national team is voting against it. Are you doing that because she told you to, or does the science suggest that's the right thing to do?
The science suggests it's the right thing to do, and my clinical observation over many years of practice is that legalising cannabis is not a good, safe and healthy thing to do. So it's my personal and professional opinion as well.
But prohibition hasn't worked, has it? People still smoke it.
Yes, does that make it right though? And I think what we're doing here, my concern here amongst other things, is that if there is an appetite for cannabis reform, we're going right from nothing all the way to legalising. Now, a large number of countries have stopped at decriminalisation and various other steps on the way, let alone medicinal cannabis.
Okay.
It seems a big jump to go all the way there.
If more than 50% of people who vote say that they want this to happen, for cannabis to be legal, do you think your party should honour that democratic vote and push forward with the legislation?
What we've already announced through our drug spokesperson, the Honourable Nick Smith, is that we will take a party position on it and we'll be voting against it. But if the people of New Zealand decide that this is where they'd like to progress, we will introduce the legislation in our hands and we will take it to select committee.
Okay, let's move on to the so-called Heather Simpson report, Chris. This is the biggest report into the health system in 2 decades. It's basically a blueprint for the future. Have you read the whole thing yet?
Yes. I read it at the time that it was released. Obviously, I wasn't the Minister of Health at the time, and I've been working my way through more detailed consideration of that.
Right,
but
so
it's fair to say
bits...
the government's not made detailed decisions
why
on
not?
that report yet.
Why not? Because people are going to have to vote. They want to know what you're going to do. So which bits are you committed to implementing, and by when?
Yeah, and look, and different parties will set out their manifestos. So the Labour Party will set out its manifesto on the Simpson review. I'm not going to be announcing that here today. I know you'll be disappointed by that.
When will you tell people?
It will be in the next few weeks, and we will set out our manifesto that will set a clear direction of travel. But the direction of travel will be broadly consistent with what's in the report.
So you'll cut DHBs?
There'd certainly be fewer of them. We haven't landed on an exact number yet, or what the boundaries of that might be. But yes, there would be fewer DHBs.
So when you make this information public prior to the election, are you going to be specific about which DHBs would be up for the chop in your next term?
Look, we haven't quite finalised that detail yet, but we'll certainly have more specifics about that.
So people will go to the polls not really understanding what your complete position is on this report.
No, we do want to make sure that when people go to the polls, they'll know what to expect from us out of our implementation of the Simpson report.
OK, Shane, is it too bloated, the system? Should you get rid of some of those DHBs?
Let's just come back to that for a moment. That's a really important part of the health system, that purportedly the DHBs will be reduced from what they are down to 8 to 12. And I do think that if that is the direction of travel which we're hearing, that needs to be put on the campaign trail. Which DHBs are going, which DHBs are standing. Tell us what it is. If you're late in the piece, show us what your early thinking is anyway. But either way, this is a very important campaign item, and I think the Minister should come forward with what's in
Well,
and
what's the National Party going to do? What's the National Party's position?
We've already said that we won't be changing any of the bricks and mortar DHBs. We'll be maintaining them as they are. But there is some aggregation, for example, around regional planning, where some parts of the strategy and planning functions might well serve a region where they could come together, so that some of the functions might aggregate. But we won't be taking away from any particular areas DHBs as proposed in the Simpson report, and I think you should put that on the campaign trail. Just tell people which ones are going.
The last national government was already doing that. They had combined boards for a number of different health boards. They were basically hauling out services and combining them. This was stuff that the last national government were doing, so they seem to have changed their position and now be going the other way.
No change at all. What we weren't doing was removing 8 to 12 DHBs and not telling people before an election, and I think that's what we should be doing. I think it's very important information.
Chris, can you tell us, would you scrap the capital charge of 6% per annum on building-related debt for DHBs? Could you commit to that?
Look, there's been quite a lot of discussion with the Treasury about the capital charge regime, and we would look to do some reform in that area, yes. We haven't actually made final decisions about that.
Will you ditch it?
No, I can't do that here, but we do have a process of looking at the overall capital charging regime.
So you're thinking of lowering it, or where are you tracking with this?
Well, potentially, one of the issues is whether you differentiate between buildings that they've got now and future buildings, new buildings. So those are the sorts of things that we're looking at.
Shane, would you ditch it?
No, I wouldn't ditch it. And just remember, the capital charge goes past health as well, goes across to other entities also. And, there's been a mechanism in place during coronavirus where there's been some offset, so some DHBs haven't been able to confront the full effect of capital charge. But that's a deeper piece of thinking. OK,
we've got about 3 minutes left, so let's go quickly. Canterbury DHB is hemorrhaging medical professionals. There's accusations of a hostile board. Have you been to see them, Chris, and how are you going to fix it?
No, I haven't been to see them yet. I have been in regular communication with a number of different people associated with the Canterbury DHB. Look, Canterbury does have some issues. If you look at their deficit, they're clocking
some issues. Would that not be a bit of an understatement?
Quite a few, but if you look at their deficit, they're clocking up a third of the deficits of all DHBs put together. So they've got some challenges ahead, and that can't all be attributed to the capital spend as a result of the Christchurch earthquakes. There's a whole variety of different issues here. I think everybody's looking for black and white answers and black and white definitions of the problem when they don't necessarily exist. It's a pretty complex situation. But what is clear is that relationships have broken down badly. There's a new management team in place. It started this week. I do think we need to give them a chance to steady the ship.
Shane, some people say it's a legacy of poor funding decisions on the part of your government, so how do they know if you got in next time that you wouldn't make what they see as the same mistakes?
So the argument there is during the earthquake, should they have had a special funding mechanism instead of population-based funding? Look, that's looking back 9 years. I can't comment on that. We have a funding mechanism that funds all DHBs proportional fundamentally to their population. I think the issues at Canterbury, though, I agree they are dysfunctional, but I think the Minister needs to get bit closer to that. Okay, so having a Crown monitor between the Minister and the Board, I'm not clear if that's useful to us in getting really effective leadership on this. Furthermore, if we look at some of that...
So if you were the Health Minister, you'd get down there and talk to them?
I darn well would. I'd be down speaking to the chairperson, setting clear expectations, making sure I understood the problems absolutely. When it's told to me that, part of the issue here is that we have inefficient facilities, they specifically mentioned the Hagley block, and that 60 million of the deficit is attributable to that, and that if that had been built on time, they would be to budget here and now. That would seem to be something that's correctable.
OK, the clock is kicking down on us, so I want a yes or no answer here from you, Chris. Would you bring in better public health service targets like National had to track immunisations and rheumatic fever, for example, in your next term? You scrap them and those numbers have gone badly.
Pardon me, we will have some alternative targets. I think National's targets were too narrow and they were too prone to be gamed, but we will have some targets.
Shane, Reti, will you have those targets
Absolutely
back?
Have those targets. It's interesting to hear the Minister for 3 years they've talked about, no, we don't believe in targets, and suddenly we're hearing them a few weeks before an election. So maybe they've sort of seen the benefit and the focus that targets bring.
OK, do you have private health insurance, Shane?
I do.
Chris, yes or no? Private health insurance?
Yes, I do.
Thank you both.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata with DNA. 468 people associated with the Mount Roskill Church cluster and all their close contacts have been asked to get retested for COVID-19 as the Auckland cluster grows. The Mount Roskill Evangelical Fellowship is at the centre of a subcluster of 43 positive cases. Health correspondent Rowan Quinn reports.
All 6 new cases announced today are part of the church subcluster. Hundreds of church members were at services and a wedding shortly before the Level 3 lockdown. The Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, says even though most of them have already been tested, health officials want to make sure they're on top of the cluster's spread. The St Dominic's College student who has the virus does not belong to the church, but had been at the same house a church member visited while infected. Ko Rowan Quinn, DNA.
Labour won't say if its plan to raise the top tax rate will be a bottom line in any coalition negotiations after the election. The party wants anyone earning above $180,000 a year to pay a new rate of 39%, up from the current 33%. The Green Party doesn't think it goes far enough. Checkpoint asked Finance spokesperson Grant Robertson if the policy could change if the party ends up trying to form a coalition government.
It's not a matter of bottom lines for us from this perspective. And I haven't actually heard the Green Party use that phrasing either. From our perspective, this is what we will implement, just what we announced today.
Labour's finance spokesperson Grant Robertson. The Electoral Commission is considering a complaint about Billy Te Kahika's NZ Public Party and its collection and use of donations. A spokesperson for the Commission says the Serious Fraud Office passed on the complaint. The Electoral Commission can look into a complaint but will pass it to the police if they believe there is any wrongdoing. Mr Te Kahika's party has gained a following through sharing conspiracy theories online about COVID-19 and foreign influence. It has formed an alliance with former National MP Jamie Lee Ross's Advance New Zealand party. Corrections admits it has opened itself up to the possibility of legal action as it may have broken the law by confining prisoners to their cells for more than 23 hours a day. On multiple occasions this year, inmates at the Auckland Regional Women's Correctional Facility have been denied the 1 hour out of their cells each day required under the Corrections Act. Chief Custodial Officer Neil Beals says the prison does not have adequate records to check how many times this occurred or whether it was justified. He says a new monitoring system is now ensuring all women are receiving at least an hour of exercise outside of their cells each day. The Veterinary Association is calling for greater transparency and better monitoring of cattle on the ships before any consideration is given to lifting the temporary ban on live exports. The ban was brought in last week after the sinking of the carrier Gulf Livestock 1 in the East China Sea. 28,000 cattle are on quarantine farms waiting to be sent to China. Association Chief Veterinary Officer Helen Beattie says it will be essential to have an independent animal welfare scientist on board the next ship if the ban is lifted.
And that would then give us a whole bunch of really objective measures to understand what that experience of the actual trip itself looks like and feels like for those animals. So it's very hard to make a definitive comment when we don't have that really critical piece of information.
Helen Beattie says it will be hard to support a resumption in exports without a welfare assessment. National will create a new bank to provide finance and advice to central and local government infrastructure projects, if elected. Existing agencies, including Crown Infrastructure Partners, Green Investment, Provincial Growth Fund loans and residual holdings at Crown Irrigation Investments Limited, would be consolidated into the bank. National Party leader Judith Collins says it will offer investors such as ACC and NZ Super Fund an avenue to take on investment risk in New Zealand infrastructure assets. Ms Collins says the bank would bring together the expertise the infrastructure sector needs.
As someone who was a minister who had to deal with big projects, it was really clear that sometimes we had to get in expertise from sometimes offshore in order to be able to put some more grunt into the decision making around contracts and also how to deliver on them.
National Party leader Judith Collins. New Zealand share market has had a sharp fall as it was caught in the aftermath of a major sell-off on Wall Street. US markets closed as much as 4% lower as heavyweight technology stocks continued to be sold after a record-breaking run came to a halt last week. The local top 50 index closed down 156 points or 1.3%, its second biggest fall in 4 days and to its lowest level in 3 weeks. The New Zealand market hit a record high in February and after plunging when COVID-19 first hit, has since recouped all its losses to be up 2% for the year. The fall in US stocks has been put down to investors being spooked by markets having gone too high too fast. It's coming up to 5.5 minutes past 6. Double Olympic 800 metres champion Caster Semenya has lost her appeal to the Swiss Federal Tribunal to set aside a court of arbitration for sport ruling that female athletes with high natural testosterone levels must take medication to reduce it. But the South African has indicated that she may continue her battle in the European and domestic courts ahead of the Olympics in Tokyo next year, vowing to fight for human rights. Semenya approached the tribunal in May last year after CAS Sport's highest court ruled that the regulations of the sport's governing body, World Athletics, were necessary for athletes with differences in sexual development in races ranging from 400 metres to a mile to ensure fair competition. The top-seeded Milwaukee Bucks have been eliminated from the NBA basketball playoffs by the 5th-seeded Miami Heat. The Heat have convincingly won the best-of-7 Eastern Conference semi-final series 4-1 after a 103-94 win in Game 5. And Cristiano Ronaldo has set his sights on Iran's Ali Daei's record of 109 international goals after the Portugal football superstar became just the second male player to crack the century mark. Ronaldo scored both of Portugal's goals in their 2-1 Nations League win over Sweden that saw him reach 101 goals for his country since his debut in 2004. That's the news.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
Well, the government, I think, obviously had no direct experience of, shall we say, running an insurance company.
Live with local, national and international stories and a slice of creativity.
He was like a fly on the wall, really, to their lives. That's probably why the photographs are so special.
Up to date if you're up late. Lately with Karen Hay every weeknight from 10 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waikato, Coromandel and Bay of Plenty. Cloudy periods, brief rain tomorrow night. Waitomo to Wellington, including Taumaranui. Mostly cloudy, gale northerlies about Wellington. A period of rain tomorrow, briefly heavy. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, including Taupo and Taihape. Fine weather. Gale nor'westerlies about Wairarapa. Rain developing tomorrow with snow lowering to 1,000 metres. For Nelson and Marlborough, fine tonight. Rain developing tomorrow morning. Easing to showers tomorrow afternoon. Buller and Westland, cloudy periods with a few showers turning to rain from the south tonight, clearing tomorrow evening. Canterbury and Otago except Clutha, rain spreading north tonight, snow lowering to 700 metres overnight, then easing to showers tomorrow. Gale nor'westerlies inland easing tonight. Fiordland, Southland and Clutha, rain clearing. Showers developing from late tonight. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, rain developing tomorrow night. RNZ National. It's coming up to 8.5 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Corrections has admitted it has acted outside of the law by confining women to their cells at Auckland Women's Prison for more than 23 hours a day. Women at the jail, 67% of whom are Māori, have been denied their minimum entitlement to 1 hour out of their cells for exercise on multiple occasions this year, including 16 times in just a 2-week period. That sparked an internal corrections review, which was released this week. It described a punitive culture at the jail, dysfunctional management, and a lack of health staff to care for the women inside. RNZ's Guyon Espiner, who broke the story, asked Corrections Chief Custodial Officer Neil Beals why they are breaking the rules at the country's largest women's prison.
There are definitely cases where it hasn't happened as it should do. You've spoken to the Regional Commissioner earlier. They've owned that, they've acknowledged that there are certain things that weren't happening that should have been happening. I can tell you now that it's not happening right now at this site.
It's not happening now, but the example I gave, which was between March 29 and April 10, it happened 16 out of 30 times they looked at.
There are times when actually breaching a minimum entitlement isn't actually breaking the law, because there are certain occasions under the law where you're actually allowed to breach minimum entitlements. That could be for health and safety reasons, it could be for a security issue at the prison, or to prevent harm to somebody else. But particularly in COVID, we were affected quite heavily by that, where because of the use of bubbles and restricting space between people, unfortunately there were times when we could not meet those minimum standards.
Yes, but you had this lock-up regime before COVID.
Which is why I'm saying you're correct, you're going over a span of time. So I would have to have a look at those 16 incidents to see, well, what happened in that unit on that day? Was there an incident where they had to lock down? Was it a case of somebody, for argument's sake, in the management unit creating a disturbance, a protest, where they then couldn't get out of their cell, but it's been recorded?
But you didn't record them.
Correct. So we have an issue. So there's two folds here, right? There's an issue in terms of the 16, and as I said, one of the things that we found here, and in some of the other sites as well, is that I couldn't gain assurance from some of the data that was provided to me as to the rationale behind some of the unlocks, because the recording wasn't as accurate as what I would expect it to be.
So you can't sit here today confidently and say that you haven't broken the law. Not you personally, but that the law hasn't been broken at this prison, because you've locked women up for more than 23 hours at a stretch, we acknowledge that, and you do not have the assurance that it was done in line with the Corrections Act 2004.
Over the period of time you're talking about, that is correct. There are times there when I just don't have the data available, or the depth in the detail of the data to be sure that the rationale behind the instance that you're talking to would give me satisfaction that the law hasn't been breached.
And what are you going to do about that?
Well, a lot's been done about it already. I mean, you've been with us today, you've spoken to the Regional Commissioner and the Prison Director. I can tell you now at this prison, the data is accurate. I've had a look at it today myself. People are getting their minimum entitlements. There are, even in the high security unit, where people are getting out for at least an hour and a half just for exercise, there are prisoners in there who are also getting out for other activities as well, such as programs.
Sure, and there's some great stuff being done here. I've seen it with my own eyes, so I acknowledge that. But who was responsible for the fact that these women were having their minimum entitlements breached?
So there's a range of people, but ultimately, at the end of the day, we as a department, we've got to own that, right? So I'm not particularly interested right now on hauling somebody up and dealing with one specific person. I think collectively we've got to own this as a department.
How long had that been going on?
In what area?
The fact that you were locking women up for more than 23 hours and didn't know why.
I can't tell you, because I looked at it at the moment in time.
But weeks or months or years?
Well, we'd have to go back and track that data, right? So I was looking at that as a moment in time, knowing what we were facing and knowing what we were likely to be facing as COVID continued, making sure that the actions that we are taking, as far as we practically and operationally can do, make sure that people are getting the minimum entitlements.
Why are you locking women up for 22.5 to 23 hours a day in the high security unit?
They get an hour and a half out for exercise, but there are many others who are getting out in addition to that for programs and for workshops and for other activities. So it's not entirely true to say that high security you get locked down for 23.5 hours or 22.5 hours. That hour and a half that they're giving them is purely just for exercise. They also get, not all of them, and there will be various reasons for some of them refuse to work, some of them can't work, so they've got gang issues, you can't unlock them with other people, there might be health issues or whatever. But when you unlock people, you've got to then have the staff to supervise them, and you've got to put them somewhere to do something.
In that unit there were 90 women, right? How many of those roughly would be locked down for 22, 23 hours a day?
I'd have to get you those
okay,
figures.
Sure.
Right, yeah.
But why are any of those women being locked down for that long? I mean, if you look at the Mandela rules, the United Nations definition, 22 hours a day without meaningful human contact is considered solitary confinement. Why are we locking down women for 22, 23 hours a day? Why?
Because to have them wandering around the yards, in each other's faces, becoming violent, hostile with each other because there isn't anything else for them to do at that moment in time is probably worse for them, right? So if they're in their cell, they've got their TV, they've got their books, you know, they're not sitting in a barren cell with nothing. Now,
is that an ideal way to run a prison, though? How can you expect people to rehabilitate if they're locked down for 23 hours in a day?
Well, ideally, that's why you want people to attend their programs. You want them to go to work and workspace, and this jail does a lot of that. You've seen some of it today, right? So the more people you can get to do that, the better. But there are some people who we can't do that with because of the nature of their offending, the type of hostility or aggression that they may cause on the outside, whatever that issue may be. At all levels, nobody has the intention of coming down and going, I'm just going to lock you up and forget about you. Nobody wants to do that. We want to find people who are motivated, who want to do programs, who want to get engaged. That group that you saw today, they all came from high security. They're all high security prisoners, right? In the AOD group that you saw there. We need more of that. Now, what was the one thing when you said, what could be different? What was the one thing that you heard from the tutor? We want it to be longer. You know, so we want more programs like that, but all that comes with investment. It costs money. You need space to do that, and you also then need the right people to be able to engage in those programs. That's the reality of prison, Guyan. Is that unfortunately, as much as people like yourself, people like me, the staff out there, they would like to do more. You're restricted by certain, issues: money, space, time, and then the very real issue about dealing with some people who are hard to manage, and when you unlock them with other people, becomes quite dangerous for those and for the staff who manage them. These are the dynamics of running prison.
And that was Corrections Chief Custodial Officer Neil Beale speaking to Guyon Espiner. Jacinda Ardern returned to Whakatane today for the first time since the aftermath of the Whakaari White Island eruption, which killed 21 people and seriously injured 25 others. The Labour leader had morning tea with the first responders on what is the 9-month anniversary of the tragedy. Ms Ardern was struck by the resilience of the tight-knit community, which, as one first responder put it, has had its recovery hijacked by COVID-19. Political reporter Yvette McCullough and cameraman Dom Thomas were there.
9 months on, and the eruption of Whakaari White Island still plagues those who confronted the horrors of that day. For Whakatane Hospital ED clinical lead Dr Tamsin Davies, the emotions are clearly still raw. She says you wouldn't be human if this wasn't etched into your memory.
I think that it's not just us as the hospital staff that it will, have a lasting effect on. I think it's the country.
Jacinda Ardern met with first responders, the first time she's been back here since the eruption.
Time is an unusual thing at the moment. When you say 9 months, that can feel like both an eternity, but at the same time like it was only yesterday.
Ms Ardern says the extreme care first responders showed to victims has meant families overseas feel a strong connection to New Zealand.
And in some cases they even said that if they were to lose a loved one anywhere, that this is the place that they would want them to be safe and held and cared for.
Mayor Judy Turner says this visit means a lot to the first responders.
They haven't forgotten what they saw and what they had to do, and sometimes just somebody saying, we know that was hard and we're grateful for what you did, is really comforting. There's a sense of comfort in that.
Mark Inman, who lost his brother Hayden Marshall Inman in the eruption, says this tragedy has brought the already tight-knit community closer together. He says finding closure has been hard because Hayden's body has never been recovered. But every 9th of the month, a group gathers on the beach to remember him.
Life throws certain challenges at times, and this is one of them. And it's a moment in time in life that you're just going to have to, stay strong and remember. And it's about remembering all the good times. it's remembering who Hayden was and what Whakaare's about.
Mr Inman says COVID-19 has dealt another blow to the community, and sadly he thinks it will impact plans for marking the 1-year anniversary for many of the international families.
And that's going to be tough for them. I know my sister can't make it out, so that'll be tough.
The fallout from the eruption and then COVID-19 has hit the local tourism industry hard. Diveworks Charters owner Steph van der Schooten says while now is always a quiet period, they didn't make enough over the summer to see them through winter. Her husband has had to pick up extra work through the council's Kia Kaha program, cleaning sewers.
Our town is getting all their sewers nice and clean. And we're really, really thankful because we've got food on the table, so we're happy.
She says she's feeling optimistic that when summer comes, New Zealanders will flock to explore their own backyard and help keep businesses like hers afloat. From Whakatane for Checkpoint, Yvette McCullough.
Meanwhile, National leader Judith Collins has promised a royal commission will investigate the fatal Whakaari White Island eruption if her party is elected in October. She says the people affected want answers and the current WorkSafe investigation won't be enough.
It's a big magnitude when it comes to just how unsafe that worksite was. I think it deserves it. It is a huge loss of people and massive injuries to others whose lives were saved. I think there should be one into it. I think it's something that New Zealanders would want to see.
On the campaign trail in Wellington today, Ms Collins announced National's plan to create a new bank to provide finance and advice to central and local government infrastructure projects. The Crown Financial Institution would consolidate a number of existing agencies, including Crown Infrastructure Partners, Green Investment, Provincial Growth Fund loans and residual holdings at Crown Irrigation Investments Limited. Ms Collins says the bank would offer investors such as ACC and the New Zealand Super Fund an avenue to take on investment risk in New Zealand infrastructure assets. She was asked how logical it is to merge the existing agencies.
Well, we think it's really important to have the quality of experience and knowledge around borrowings and also the disciplines around that. Certainly, as someone who was a minister who had to deal with big projects, it was really clear that sometimes we had to get in expertise from sometimes offshore in order to be able to put some more grunt into the decision making around contracts and also how to deliver on them.
That was National Party leader Judith Collins speaking in Wellington this afternoon. Funding for the Infrastructure Bank would come from baseline funding from the merged agencies, but full costings are yet to be completed. It is almost 22 minutes after 6. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Southland workers at the endangered Tiwai Point smelter are frustrated it's taken political leaders so long to take their livelihoods seriously. In July, Rio Tinto announced production would end at the plant in August next year, putting more than 2,000 jobs at risk. But New Zealand First leader Winston Peters says the smelter is the most eco-friendly in the world and there's no reason it can't continue operating for decades, something he promises to make happen if back in government. Our political reporter Joe Moyer is in Southland.
Winston Peters told Tiwai Point workers this morning he's the only one they can trust to keep their jobs safe.
Now the whole narrative is going to change, but I do not expect to be standing around any negotiating table having an argument about this matter. And that is the bottom line.
But for engineer Richard Snook, who fears he will have to return to the North Island if the smelter closes, the promises are coming late in the piece.
My frustration was around why wasn't something done earlier, while he's still in government, to be able to get us over the line and get us to the point where we can feel safe and secure in our jobs.
Addressing a crowd of workers at the site, Mr Peters told them they need to start standing up for themselves.
Why are you taking this stuff? Why aren't you riding in the streets? Because you've got a great industry, the best aluminium product in the whole wide world, and yet you're apologising for it. I can't understand that.
Today was his second trip to the Deep South to meet with and promise Tiwai Point workers a future at the smelter. And he didn't hold back when workers questioned why he hadn't done more for them.
Oh, that's pretty rich. Excuse me, you only gave me 7.2% of the vote. last time. You give me some real vote and I'll do it. Look how much we've done already. You're going to have to vote this time like your life and your career and your industry depends upon it.
Stuart Hamilton, the chief executive of TY Point, says it's stressful for families at the smelter who have no idea what the future holds.
The people I talk to on site, they want to come to site every day and do their best job and continue to do so. That's not just for themselves, but for the family members and Southlanders as well. So they certainly want to just be able to get on and keep doing their job. And so it is frustrating to the team and certainly has an impact.
The workers are keen to hear from politicians, especially if there's a lifeline at the end of it. But Winston Peters says National and Labour are Johnny-come-latelys who can't be trusted to save Southlanders' jobs. He says in the case of Labour and the Greens, they want TY Point out of business because it doesn't suit their agenda. Labour leader Jacinda Ardern rejected that, saying it was Rio Tinto who wanted out.
Rio Tinto have made their own commercial decision, and their decision has been that they wish to cease operating at TY. Now the question is, how can we plan that exit so that we make use of the energy resource that will exist, and also that we make sure people have high quality, high wage jobs once it's exited?
One thing is for sure, the future of TY Point is now a political football that parties won't be able to escape during the campaign. For the workers who have felt their cries for help have fallen on deaf ears for years, it's a small blessing. From Southland for Checkpoint, Joe Moyer.
The coronavirus has hit cycling's most famous race, but the Tour de France is still continuing for now at least. The race director and 4 team staff members have tested positive. If any of those 4 teams have another positive test, they have to withdraw from the race. Officials in France are concerned about an uptick in cases across the country, with another 6,500 new cases recorded in the last 24-hour period. As the BBC's Lucy Williamson reports, there are signs in the south of France that hospital beds are starting to fill up again.
Testing here has become a weapon against the spread of anxiety, as rapid and silent as the virus itself. One Paris mayor is offering free coronavirus tests for anyone who wants one, without appointment, symptoms or any contact with a confirmed case. The deputy mayor says they're running at full capacity.
If we would have to test only people with symptoms or contact people, it would be simpler for sure.
Simpler, but maybe more dangerous?
Maybe more dangerous, because we identify positive cases that don't have any symptom and just don't know how it happened.
Today the Prime Minister announced that he would need to test and isolate, hours after being filmed bumping fists with local officials in southwestern France.
Je me trouvais à une étape du Tour de France.
I was at the Tour de France on Saturday, and I just learnt that the director of the event has tested positive. I will therefore immediately take a test myself and observe the rules.
New infections have risen steadily here in the past few weeks. The number of red zones where the virus is actively circulating has grown from 2 to 28. The government says the situation is worrying. Young people were seen as driving the rise in infections here over the summer. Because they're more resistant to the virus, there was no corresponding spike in hospital admissions. But as infections have spread, there are signs that may be starting to change. Hospitals in Marseille have begun raising the alarm. One doctor told me there had been an explosion of severe cases of coronavirus at his hospital, with 70 patients admitted since mid-August. 15 of them are now in intensive care, with more arriving every day.
The curve is exponential at this time. So there's no doubt that the number of patients in the hospital and in the ICU will increase in the next 15 days or 3 weeks. This will be a difficult period again.
France is now carrying out 1 million tests a week to try and avoid another lockdown. Mask wearing is already compulsory throughout several cities, including Marseille. But with people now back in offices and schools, this is a high-risk moment, and the next few weeks will be key.
And that was the BBC's Lucy Williamson with that report. Let's get to some of your feedback about Labour's tax policy announced today by Grant Robertson, 39 cents in the dollar over 180k. He says it'll raise about $500 million a year. Rachel says, I am so underwhelmed by Labour's tax policy. I'm in the proposed top tax bracket and would happily pay the rate for 150k and above. The average wage, she reckons, is about 52k. Anyone on 52k should only pay the lowest tax rate of 10.5%, says Rachel. Vicky says, I'm in the 180k plus tax bracket, fully support this policy, capital letters for fully support. Earning this much money affords me many benefits those on lower incomes don't have. And no, I couldn't avoid it because my income is my salary. My employer doesn't employ a trust, it employs me. This is a balanced and fair policy and I'm all for it, says Vicky. On our health discussion with Chris Hipkins from Labour and Shane Reti from National, this person says Minister Hipkins doesn't seem to understand that the doctors and nurses we train are primarily deployed in the Australian health system because the pay here is so appallingly low. Someone else calling Shane Reti out, saying he doesn't seem to realise how common it is for Aucklanders to live and work on opposite sides of the city. A suburb approach would fail miserably. That's in respect to lockdowns. He believes, Shane Reti believes, postcode lockdowns are possible. And this person says, listening to Shane Reti and Hipkins, what a dream team. Why can't we have them working together formally right now? The election is a side issue. Another person agrees, saying they appear to be substantially in agreement on the path ahead. Good to hear them moving forward. They could be mistaken for working for the same team. It appears to me that their respective ideas are relatively complementary. Do check out our stories online, particularly the video ones. First up, we'll be with you first thing in the morning. We're back tomorrow evening.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. 468 people linked to the Mount Roskill Church cluster in Auckland have been asked to get retested for COVID-19. The Electoral Commission is looking into a complaint about how donations to Billy Te Kahika's NZ Public Party were collected and used. An Auckland prison may have broken the law by denying inmates 1 hour outside their cells each day. Labour's facing criticism for promising a new top tax rate for the country's highest earners. National plans to create a new bank to provide finance and advice to government infrastructure projects if elected. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Tonight on Nights, Brian's back. He's speaking with Professor David Lee of Manchester Metropolitan University about the extent to which our love of flying is contributing to climate change. It's the first report of its kind since 2000.